All right, what do we see here?
Hmm.
So we're in what stage of the game?
Endgame, pass pawn.
End game for sure. Yep. And white has a pass pawn. That is correct. But we also have a couple of pawns of our own, right? So this puzzle, the theme of this puzzle is winning a pawn end game, right?
Right.
Converting a pawn advantage and winning the end game. So what is the only way that either of these players are going to win the end game?
Promote.
Promoting, right? Good. So how do you see best to accomplish that?
We want to promote a pawn, but we may want to get rid of that rook potentially.
Okay. So the way you start with these ones, right? Obviously, we don't have any good checks in the position. This isn't like a one move checkmate sort of thing. It's an end game analysis, right? So you always have to think about, it's black's turn, so black gets to move next. But after black moves, how many turns will it take to promote this pawn, right? So white needs 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to promote this pawn, right? And so you would think about, can the king get to the pawn in that amount of time, right? That's what you would think about to see if you can stop the pawn's movement. However, that doesn't apply here because white has a nice rook that is protecting the file completely. So black's king could never cross this way anyway, right? So when you see that sort of thing where the king isn't going to be able to stop the pawn anyway, it becomes less about who's going to get there first and more about or like it's not about you stopping it with the king. It's more about you just pushing your pawns in some way to promote first, right?
And the queen causes a barrier there. The white
Yeah,
queen.
The king, yeah.
Yeah, this king here is a defender of this square. And so if we push this way, it's just going to get captured.
And below the black, the green square below the pawn.
Mm-hmm. And this one, yeah, you're right. So the king can't even come this way, even if it wanted to, right? So our job is not going to be to stop this pawn because there's no way for us to viably do that. It's going to be to promote one of these pawns.
Right.
Does that make sense to everyone? Is that like an easy way to think about how to evaluate this endgame position? Because there's a lot of different ways that you can think about endgame positions, and just figuring out which one your focus is the way to figure out how to do it. So what moves do we want to make here to try to, which pawn do we think is the best one to move to try to promote?
I think the G pawn.
The G pawn. Okay. We have 1, 2, 3 moves for that. And then what?
Well, then he's going to capture with a rook.
Mm-hmm.
We'll capture with the king, and then we can promote the F pawn, and he'll be protected from his king. And you just got to do that all before he gets advantage with his queen, because he's probably going to promote too, since he's only 1 square behind us.
Good. So like Steve said, he's 1 move behind us, right? So if we start pushing this way, he's going to continue down the same. So the only move really that we can make that makes sense, since we can't move our king and, we can't get to this pawn anyway, the only move really that does make sense is moving this G pawn. Moving the E pawn doesn't really make sense because it could just get captured. And then, white is free to promote without us being able to do anything about it. And so moving the G pawn, I think, is best. So now the B pawn is continuing to go forward. So now what do we want to do? Do we want to keep pushing?
Keep pushing the G pawn.
Keep pushing. Yeah. Okay. So the puzzle doesn't go the whole way through, but what Steve was saying was absolutely correct. What would happen next is this pawn would push again. We would push again with our pawn. The rook would have to capture the queen that we just made. Right? Everyone's still with me? Yep. Then we take the rook. White will push 1 more square, but then we'll get to keep pushing this way, and we'll be 2 pawns up in an end game versus maybe 1 promoted queen, right? But we'll get 2 probably in the end. So it doesn't go all the way to the end, but that was absolutely the correct way to go about that position.
Would they both have a queen then?
Yeah, so there's no way to actually stop this promoting pawn. So if we calculate it out even further, so we pushed here, so white would come down 1 more square. We would push again, make a queen, force this rook to recapture. We would recapture with our king.
And the
White will push 1 more.
Promote. E pawn would promote.
Well, the E pawn would be undefended, right? Because since we moved our king off to the side.
Right.
Right. So if we push our E pawn. No, yeah, that's true. We push our E pawn with check, then the king has to recapture, and then we move this pawn up, and then we can promote that one. So that's the way we stop white from promoting. Does that make sense, everyone? Good catch, Richard. Yeah, it's a forcing move, right? You have to promote the e-pawn and put the king in check so that the king has to come back and recapture. And then we can just keep promoting f-pawn. Very good. So that was endgames get pretty tricky, but if you think about what the goal is and how to get there, that's how you can figure out like what you need to do in that position.
Can we stop for just a second?
Sure.
If the g-pawn is taken by the rook.
Yep.
Wouldn't the queen have to take the rook?
Yes. We would take the rook with the king.
Then the white queen would take the pawn and it wouldn't be able to promote.
So the king can't take this pawn because of this pawn here.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Yeah, the f pawn supports that one, right?
But then when it promotes, it could be taken by the queen.
Well, yeah, when this one promotes, it's going to be taken by the king. But then at that point, our king will be on g1, and then the f pawn can come up and check the king with support from our king on f2.
That is intricate. Okay.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm surprised the puzzle didn't go through to the end. I would have liked to see like the whole thing played out, but that's absolutely what would happen. And so, yeah, when you see such a majority on a side like this, even if white has a passed pawn or whatever, if you have a majority like this, you can force your opponent into moves that prevent them from being able to continue pushing this pawn.
Okay.
All right, let's keep going. What do we see here?
If you move your rook to the d file, you can pin the rook to the queen. I mean, the king.
So you mean this bishop here?
Right.
Okay. And then what?
I don't know.
So don't skip your steps, right? So what do we always want to look for first? Checks, then captures, then attacks, right? So this would be an attack, but you always want to look for checks first, because if a check leads to a checkmate eventually, that's always the way you want to go instead of just capturing material, right? You want to end the game.
Tunnel vision.
That's okay. So
it's the most forcing move, right? Normally in a
checks
puzzle.
are absolutely, yeah. Forcing moves are always the way to go, because it gives you the tempo to do another move and then another move and then eventually get, manipulating the position into a checkmate. So here are the squares available to the king. We don't control any of them right now, but is there any way that we could really easily?
I've played nearly 9,000 puzzles, so I know. I'll let you guys. Yeah, I know this. I've seen this
pattern before.
I think I know too.
Probably 500 times.
Steve, you know this one too?
Yeah. And then you got to move the queen over with a bishop on the next move.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a variation on a back rank, right? So here's the pattern, right? You see a king that's sort of like backed up onto the back rank, no way to move forward because there's pieces in front of it, right? It does have one piece that can block a check on the back rank, right? The rook can go this way, but you have a supporting piece that can then jump in and check the king and force the king into the corner that way. Everyone see that? It's like a two-step back rank.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, it would be deflect the king with the bishop after the check.
Absolutely. Yep, and that's the tactic, right? So rook has to block this way. There's no other way for black to get out of this check. The king can't move anywhere, right? So this rook has to block, but then that leaves a wide open light squared file, right? Or light squared diagonal. So after rook blocks, we don't want to capture because then it'll just recapture and it's an even exchange. But instead, the tactics are called deflection of the defender, right? The king is the only defender of this rook. So deflection of the defender, you check the king and it has to move into the corner. That's the only move it has. Since it's pinned, the rook is pinned to the king, right? It can't come down and block because it's pinned by the rook. So this is like almost like a double tactic because you have a deflection and also a pin. Right? And then you capture, and this is the back rank. Everyone see that?
Yeah, I wondered what a deflection was. Okay.
Yeah, deflection of the king is especially helpful or easy because the king has to move away from the spot, right? If this wasn't a king and you were just threatening another piece, that piece doesn't necessarily have to move. But in this case, the king has to move out of that space. So deflection of the king is always like the strongest deflection that there is.
Very nice.